So I see that some folks have started putting ideas into the chat, and I think that's actually a really good idea to give everyone a platform who'd like to share. So if you're comfortable sharing anything that you've written down in the chat, we'd love to sort of see what it is that you want to do. Also, this is really fun for me to see what this generation of students wants to do. This is the best part of working with these documents. Okay. So Carla talks about wanting to make an impact in my community. I think that's remarkable. We need folks to make impacts in communities, and there's so many different ways you can do that. Um, Mirella talks about education needed to make an impact on the Latino community, break down the stigma around mental health and substance use disorder. Absolutely. So I imagine there might be some interest in like culturally sensitive, culturally competent types of therapies and approaches. Kezi wants to pursue research that'll assist with the creation of policy for equality and mental health equity for refugee, underserved, and vulnerable populations. So it sounds like this comes from both a personal experience, and then I imagine you can see systemically within the system what isn't working. That's very cool. Kimberly wants to help young adults with autism transition into adulthood. Austin wants to contribute to new therapeutic methods for SUD, psychedelic integration, contribute to research recovery in the recovery field to enhance well-being, and influence policy around education of psychedelics. Emily wants to be a counselor to help children and be an advocate for youth mental health. Oh, okay. Carla, yours was more of a question. No worries. When you think about what it is that you want to do with your career, you can definitely focus on having an impact, but try to be really specific with what that looks like. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be like a 5 or 10 year plan, but in what capacity and what sphere of influence do you want to have an impact? Do you want to be working with youth and mental health? Do you want to be working with homeless youth? Do you want to be working with the foster care system? Do you want to be a clinical psychologist working with college students, with adults, with couples counseling? Or are you interested in doing research in a particular area? I'd like to think, and I imagine that Alana and Alyssa feel the same way, that I help people every day. I help them with their writing. That is one way to provide support. So that obviously is a very different impact than working with individuals in more of a clinical setting. But helping folks can look very different. It could be influencing policy. It could be working on biodiversity. The ideas here are endless, but if your goal is to make a positive change, I think really center on that and then dig deeper into what kind of changes and how you have the capacity to engage in making that change. Let's see. Talk about graduate school to study mental health conditions and factors that lead to it, interventions. Absolutely. Okay, around surrounding affordable housing, very interesting, very important. And you can research that and do work with that in so many ways, right? It could be research on the policy side. It could actually be working as a policymaker. I almost said as an influencer, and I can't believe my brain went there. As an advocate in different ways. It could actually be working with folks in the community to do that. So I think what I love seeing about all of these posts is that it seems like the consensus here is that y'all want to do work that makes a positive difference in the world because you care about your communities. And can we just like name how beautiful and how incredible that is? And I really hope that you all hold on to that because the world needs you. The world needs your motivation. It needs your goals and it needs an understanding of how to make changes through your various lived experiences. So I do really want to validate the way you're going about thinking about this already. Um, okay. Tatiana is asking a question about SOPs for MFAs. So you're absolutely right. If you're applying to an MFA, you are not going to emphasize research. You're going to really be leaning into the creative aspect. In my data set, I do not have examples of MFAs for like creative writing programs. So that is going to be a little bit different. My assumption is that those programs are going to have some very specific guidance on what they are looking for. And I'm guessing they're looking more for sort of an understanding of like your narrative, your story, how you're telling that, you're writing holistically. So I know that's a little bit vague, but I think the best place to start is to look at different MFA programs to see how they are talking about their statement of purpose or personal statement. But this idea of leaning into your motivation, you can definitely talk about how, by getting maybe an MFA in creative writing, you can develop these writing skills that you can then apply in different ways. Or maybe it is that you want to be an author. Well, what is it that you want to write about? How do you want to impact the world in that way? Are there other questions that are coming up for you all as we've started talking about this motivation that we have for going to graduate school? I will say that if you're finding that your motivation is not entirely rooted in your lived experiences, that is okay. In my statement of purpose for graduate school, I talked about wanting to research statements of purpose because of my professional experience. It was like really meta, but it didn't come from lived experiences and identities that I held. It came from the professional work I was doing and the problems I was seeing in the workplace and the ways that I didn't feel like I could serve my students. I most recently started an EDD, that's an educational doctorate, and my research interests have shifted. And so, in that, I talked about how, in my experience working with students at the women's prison and how I work as a writing tutor, I really wanted to learn more about prison education programs and how doing this EDD was going to help me understand that. That didn't come from lived experiences that I have with the criminal justice system. It came from observing my student writers and seeing what they were doing and how they were thinking and growing. And that was influencing my new interest in a particular research area. Okay, let's go ahead and now move on to talking about the next part of the framework. So we've talked about motivation, which again, as I said, is really the heart of your statement of purpose. The SOP is the only place that you're going to really talk about this motivation. So this needs to definitely be very clearly present in your document. It might not be the largest proportion of your document, but it should be very clear. So you also want to talk about your experiences. And so when we talk about experiences, we're both talking about relevant experiences that we've had that have informed and prepared you to pursue a graduate degree. Now, when I say relevant, you get to decide what's relevant because not all research experiences are relevant to you. Maybe there was another experience that really informed the way you think about a phenomenon or a topic or what you want to pursue. So you get to decide what this scope is. I will encourage you to remember, though, that when someone reads your statement of purpose, they're also going to have access to your CV or resume. So you don't have to cover everything in your statement of purpose because they're going to be able to see that elsewhere. Think about these two documents working together. Again, with experiences, you're talking not just about the what of the experience, but also the so what. So what is it meant to you? So what skills have you learned? So how has it informed your path forward? So how did you learn that this was not what you wanted to do and you needed to change directions? That's what really we're getting at in experiences. So this goes beyond just summarizing the CV or resume and into something that has a little bit more depth. So here are some questions that I'd like you to think about. And what I'm going to ask you to do is take another couple minutes to brainstorm. And I want you to decide if you either just want to make a list of experiences or if you just want to focus on one and kind of dig into what did you do, what did you learn, and what was formative about the experience? How has it prepared you for graduate school? So really, I'm asking you to think broadly here about what are the experiences you've had and how they prepared you for grad school. Experiences could be research, could be educational, could be in the classroom, could be professional, could be volunteering, extracurricular, leadership, internships, community involvement, whatever it might be. So let's take another like 2-ish minutes to do some brainstorming, and then I'd like us to share out again because I think it's helpful to see how other folks are thinking about this. Okay, I see that some folks, well, let me start by saying go ahead and finish up the last sentence or phrase that you're on, finish getting that idea down. I see some folks have been putting ideas into the chat. I think that's a great way to capture this. And what I'm also seeing is very clearly like, I did this thing and I learned this thing. That is a great way to be thinking about your experiences. Not that I want to minimize your experience by saying thing, but broadly, that idea is about move as a way to do this. Um, as I'm just sort of scrolling through, I think that you all have a really good start with this. What I want you to be thinking about is, as you're writing this, I want you to be thinking about me asking you why. Tell me more. Make that connection. Try to dig a little bit deeper at the idea. Feel free to keep putting ideas into the chat, but I'm wondering if anyone would like to talk through very briefly an experience, sort of what they learned and how it's influenced their path to graduate school. Is anyone interested in sharing?
I can share a bit about mine.
Yeah.
I more so touched on my educational experiences, kind of ranging all the way back to like middle school, developing this interest, and then going to a law magnet school in high school, and how that kind of led me to study history, um, and then want to keep pursuing that. So it's like being informed that I'm interested in American government, politics, how these affect our daily lives today, leading me to a history undergrad and then maybe wanting to continue that research in like a master's program.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Can I ask, what do you think you want to do after you earn your master's?
I've been thinking about getting into education. So like kind of I'm really interested in like sharing information and what I've learned about history with other people, teaching it to students in the way that kind of I wish I was taught it, and then just expanding that knowledge generally, because there's so many things that we've yet to find out and like collections we've yet to explore. So just kind of expanding the body of knowledge that we have and then sharing that with people.
I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. I think what's
Yeah,
really interesting here is this pairing between like, I have this interest in this topic and I want to share it with folks. I want to keep exploring the bounds of it. That might, you could frame that as both wanting to continue to do research and or wanting to be an educator, wanting to be in a space where you get to connect students with different museums or archives or historical knowledge. You don't have to have that all totally figured out right now, but the fact that you know that's where you want to go helps to make an argument as to why a particular program would be right for you.
for sure.
Thank you for sharing. I saw someone who had their hand up just a minute ago and then the hand disappeared. Was it Kimberly? Did you want to share? Oh no.
My experience is like, so why I want to pursue the MSW in social work, but specifically like I'm focusing on excuse me, the autistic community is because of my experience as a parent. I have a 16-year-old. We are working through with transition services, and I've been like focused on that the past few years. And as a parent, as an educator, I've been like working with students for years. And that is always a part that's missing. It is that transition from high school into being an adult. So I feel like it's myself and actually a colleague. We've been talking about it, and she's also interested in doing something similar. So we want to make an impact in the community.
Thank you, Kimberly, for sharing that. I hope what you all heard from what Kimberly shared is that this interest comes from a multitude of experiences, right? It is both a personal lived experience, but then also a professional experience and seeing this gap and this thing that isn't happening, or we don't have enough understanding of it, or we want to provide more services. I think, Kimberly, that makes for a very compelling argument for why you would want to go and pursue this type of program so that you can develop skills and help expand resources to help solve this. And when I say problem, I don't mean the humans are the problem. I mean that the system and the structure is not there to provide that support in the way that we want. Think again, notice the cause and effect here and then the connection between the experiences and the motivation. Very well said, Kimberly. I think you're going to have a really interesting MSW application.
Thank you.
Seeing some other ideas pop into the chat. And again, I just want to validate that the way you all are thinking about this, I mean, for giving you 2 minutes of brainstorming, that's it. I appreciate that you're making that move between, well, I did this thing and it was cool and it was interesting and I learned stuff and I saw problems or I saw issues or I was inspired to do this. Lean into that cause and effect. Absolutely. I'm wondering if I could pick on Alana or Alyssa to share why they decided to pursue graduate degrees. What influenced that for them? You can also just say no, Erin. We won't do that.
Yeah, I can share, but it's not the best story. Like when I have my graduate degrees in law and public affairs. Again, Alana Beitzel at the Rating Center. So I did a joint program in at the law school and the public affairs school at my university. And when I was wrapping up my undergraduate degrees in liberal arts, I had kind of a vague sense of wanting to help people, and thought that that might be in the form of law and policy. But through that experience, ended up realizing how much I had a passion for teaching writing, working with writers, which I was doing at the time. So not the best recommend, like don't do what I did, which is to vaguely apply to a graduate program. And yeah, so not a great story, Erin, to share.
I actually think this is a fabulous story to share, and thank you for sharing and for letting me totally put you on the spot. But this idea that you had this sense you knew you wanted to help people. And I'm going to guess a lot of the folks in this virtual space with us have that same passion. Cool. I want you all to hold on to that. Then I want you to dig deeper into how do you want to help people? I've seen a number of students who think the way to help people is immediately, well, I've got to become a doctor or I've got to become a lawyer. And if that's what your path is, fabulous, amazing. But what I'm hearing, Alana, is that through other professional experiences you had, you learned this passion was actually helping people in a slightly different lens. It wasn't maybe through the law or through policy, but through writing. Is that a fair way to frame that story?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to put words on your experience because it's not my experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a little bit more nuanced than that. I will say, because I know there are some folks in the room who are considering law school, and I would be happy to talk offline more about this, but I really don't recommend going to law school unless you really want to be a lawyer. I really benefited from the experience and learned a lot, but I think as a professional degree, you really want to have a very clear sense of what you want to do going into a program like that. I think similar to why you would apply to medical school. Don't apply to medical school unless you actually want to be a doctor. But I do think really kind of engaging, as Erin was describing, in really reflection about kind of what draws you to a particular program. When I talk with writers about personal statements, I often like to think of it as, what brought you to this moment in your life? What brought you to this moment in your journey where you were sitting down and deciding, like, this is what I want to do next? And think about the experiences that stood out to you along the way that kind of help shaped that decision, because we don't just, or maybe some of us do, realize, wake up one day and like, I'm applying to a graduate program. There's a series of steps and experiences that got us there. So kind of framing that journey, I think the kind of journey language there is really important. Yeah. So, but again, if anyone has particular interest in those two areas, feel free to follow up with me after.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I appreciate it. Alyssa, did you have anything you wanted to share?
I guess I would share what led me ultimately to graduate school. I have a master's in education. Was the time after undergrad and some experiences in the workforce that I had that just kind of piqued an interest in pivoting. My undergrad is applied economics, so it's like kind of a different world. But the underlying thread there is I've always had an interest in environmental conservation. I did conservation work or my applied academics degree was focused on natural resources. So I did conservation work afterwards, but I also did some teaching afterwards. And then when I went to my master's for education, I wound up kind of marrying those experiences. My thesis was all about environmental education for early childhood development. Um, so, this is many years back, but I've stayed in education, obviously, different angles. And honestly, I'm so grateful for that experience. I learned so much for the master's program, and it was highly impactful. So.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for sharing that. Also, this is just really fun to learn about people and their trajectories and what they're interested in and motivated in. But like Alana is also saying in the chat, there is no reason that you have to immediately go to graduate school after undergrad. I took 2 years off between well, 2 years off. I was teaching English and doing other work between my bachelor's and my master's. And it was that experience where I learned, oh, yes, I wanted to teach English. I also did not want to work with children because I found them slightly terrifying. And I didn't want to deal with like behavioral stuff in the classroom. So that helped me understand the population I wanted to work with. And then it was again between my master's and the start of my PhD that I understood the scope of what I was interested in. So there's no rush here. Like thinking about what it is that you're wanting and where you want to go and what other experiences you might like to have before starting graduate school.